The Super Nintendo 16-bit offering that would go head to head with a Sega Mega Drive in perhaps the most memorable console war of all time. A game console that functioned as the long-awaited sequel to the NES that would captivate players' imaginations in the early 90s with its flashy graphics and Nintendo flair. In this special upload on the channel, we are going to go back in time and look at the historic launch of the now legendary console in various different regions around the world. This will include looking at the platform's development, its battle against Sega, and Nintendo's positioning around the globe. The Super Nintendo made up an extremely important chapter of my childhood, so I thought why not celebrate that by looking at the system's glorious birth. Roses are red, the sky is clear. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Big Daddy Top Hat here, welcoming you all to another exciting video right here on the Top Hat Gaming Man channel. This is the epic launch of the Super Nintendo. Yeah! It is the late 1980s. We are coming towards a pivotal period in the exciting history of gaming. Over in Japan, the Nintendo Famicom broke all sales numbers, and its NES counterpart has managed to receive the same results in North America too. All in all, contributing to the system managing to become the greatest selling game console in history thus far. Nintendo in countries like Japan and the USA had become a huge deal, with legend suggesting that in certain places the word Nintendo was simply being used as a synonym for video games themselves. Hey mom, can I play Nintendo tapes this Thanksgiving? Europe, being made up of many smaller but wealthy economies, meant that the NES's success in the region would be more splintered, with the system, for example, for a while only being distributed in the UK through Boots Pharmacy, with microcomputers like the ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64 and Amstrad CPC 464 continuing to hold the largest market shares. This was reflected throughout much of Europe and even Australia and New Zealand, both of which also fell under the control of Nintendo of Europe. The exception to the rule was in a few Nordic countries such as Norway, Denmark and Finland, all of which was handled by the Swedish distribution company Bergsala, a company ran by Ore Bergsten, who had set up a deal with Nintendo personally and managed to do a much better job of marketing the system than the handling of it in other European regions. Elsewhere in the world, NES games managed to eventually find audiences, but mostly through the use of Famicom systems. Nintendo games were spreading and spreading, even if sometimes through piracy. All of this is important for context as we look at Nintendo's positioning throughout the global marketplace nearing the end of the 1980s. The winds of change would slowly begin to blow in Nintendo's home of Japan, where competition to the Famicom/NES's dominance was beginning to emerge. You see, 1987 would see the release of the PC Engine, with the Sega Mega Drive following suit in 1988. Two much more powerful systems offering more impressive graphics. The two new systems on the market with their 16-bit architecture never affected Nintendo in Japan too drastically. The PC Engine managed to slowly carve out a market share, but the Mega Drive lagged behind for now, offering little in the way of games. How weird is it really that game consoles actually used to need decent games to be able to sell well? People have bought PlayStation 5s regardless! Next, for the PC Engine in 1989, it would be launched in North America as the Turbografx 16. However, it was never positioned to sell well. Eventually, the Turbografx 16 would see a release in Europe too, simply as the Turbografx, but found even less success, functioning as a mail-order only product. The Sega Mega Drive would arrive in North America in August of 1989, but it too would have a slow start due to not offering the games that would wow consumers at launch, with the packing game being Altered Beast. While all of this was taking place, Nintendo executives were in no hurry to rush out their own 16-bit console due to their market dominance. However, they realised that as these other systems' libraries were slowly built, their domination could potentially slip away over time. The same year the PC Engine had hit the market in Japan, it would be at that time that the Nintendo president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, would at least reveal to the press that the company were developing what they dubbed the Super Famicom. This was first revealed in a Japanese newspaper known as the Kyoto Shimbun. In another publication known as Touch Magazine, it would be announced that both Super Mario Bros. 4 and Dragon Quest V were in development on the system, sequels to two franchises that were both household names in Japan. Hiroshi forecast that 3 million Super Famicoms were projected to sell at launch. However, it was speculated at that time that all of this was just a business move to stop consumers ordering PC engines at Christmas of that year, and that the actual Super Famicom would not arrive for quite some time. A prediction which would turn out to have some reality to it, especially bearing in mind what would unfold next. Nintendo would clarify to Dragon Quest developers, Enix, that they had no intention of setting any sort of release date for either a 16-bit platform or a new Dragon Quest game for that matter, until they had seen how well the PC Engine had sold at the end of that year. The Super Famicom console would finally be demonstrated to the Japanese press for the first time in November of 1988, with a second showing not being until July of 1989, 2 years removed from the Super Famicom's original announcement. The Super Famicom was to be designed by a gentleman known as Masayuki Uemura, a Japanese professor who had previously found success designing the original Famicom. He and his team had worked tirelessly on the system, including with team member Ken Kutaragi, an engineer from Sony who would design the system's sound chip, which poetically would later lead to the development of the PlayStation. But that's a juicy story for another time. Ooh. The device would arrive on the market in Japan on the 21st of November 1990, and was an instant success, managing to sell out Nintendo's initial shipment of 300,000 units in just a few hours. In fact, it is said that nothing like this event had occurred thus far in history, and consumers were so hyped for this product that it led to social disturbances, and the Japanese government asking game console manufacturers to launch consoles on weekends going forward, so that business could continue as normal. According to the gaming history book known as Game Over, the launch would even catch the attention of the Yakuza, with Nintendo opting to ship the device out at night to avoid a robbery. Crazy stuff. The new Super Famicom system was an impressive piece of kit that incorporated graphics and sound co-processors that could even perform tilting and simulated 3D effects. Pair this with a colour palette offering up to 32,768 different colours, and 8-channel ADPCM audio, the Super Famicom was leaps and bounds better than the original Famicom hardware. Gamers were now playing with power. Japanese conservative businessmen's power. Substantial chip upgrades that could be found in future Super Famicom cartridges aided Nintendo in achieving even more impressive, graphically appealing games too, such as with the introduction of the Super FX chip, for example, that was developed here in the UK. Going back to the launch story, it became clear very quickly in Japan that Nintendo were on track to continue to outsell all of their 16-bit competitors, retaining their position as the nation's most popular video game console. This was of course aided by managing to hold on to so many fantastic third-party publishers, who were producing games for their system at the time rather than the competition. As for games in Japan, the system would launch with two titles: the racing game F-Zero that would show off the system's graphical prowess, including demonstrating the console's amazing Mode 7 effects, as well as the legendary Super Mario World, the game Nintendo had previously spoken to the press about when mentioning a Super Mario Bros. 4. Amusingly, in the first week they also got the release of a lackluster Bombuzzle, a puzzle game designed by Anthony Crowther that has recently reached meme status by showing up as a playable game on the Nintendo Switch online service. So which one of you asked for a 2021 re-release of this game? Honestly. Next for the Super Famicom would be its North American launch, another market where an 8-bit Nintendo console had dominated. It is of note that previously the Famicom was given a complete new format to resemble a VHS player, and paired with a light gun and Rob the Robot, and rechristened the NES bespoke for that marketplace. It is well documented that the reasoning behind this was so when approaching stores who felt burnt out on video games due to the spiralling disinterest in the Atari VCS, that the Nintendo Entertainment System was a toy rather than a game console, which as history now illustrates to us was a strategy that actually worked. But with a new Nintendo console coming to America, and the brand now fully established stateside, did the Super Famicom require the same style makeover as the original Famicom? Well, Nintendo of America felt that that was probably a good idea. This is where a gentleman named Lance Barr comes into play, who felt that the Super Famicom did not look right to tantalise Americans' taste buds. He states that the Super Famicom was maybe okay for the market in Japan. For the US, I felt that it was too soft and had no edge. We were always looking at future modular components, even the NES had a connector on the bottom, so you had to design with the idea of stacking on top of other components. I thought the Super Famicom didn't look good when stacked, and even by itself had a kind of bag of bread look. So, who looks at this, and the first thing what they think of, you know what? This really looks like a bag of bread. Do Americans literally think about nothing else but food? Years later, what Lance Barr refers to as a bag of bread would receive a modular upgrade in the form of a Satellaview, a 1995 satellite modem peripheral which players could use in Japan to purchase special broadcast satellite games. Personally, I think the Super Famicom with the Satellaview stacked underneath looks wonderful, and I want to purchase one myself eventually, even if be purely for aesthetic purposes at this point. I've always found the US Super Nintendo less attractive than its other counterparts, but would it look better paired with a hypothetical American Satellaview over the Japanese version? Let me know what you think in the comments. The system arrived in North America in August of 1991, first only shipping in limited quantity, then becoming widely available in the following month of September for $200 US. Like in Japan, Super Mario World and F-Zero would both function as launch titles, but would be joined by the likes of SimCity, Gradius 3, and Pilot Wings, a further game that would demonstrate the console's Mode 7 pseudo 3D renderings. State-of-the-art graphics, bloody marvellous, isn't it? Wonderful. While eventually managing to sell the most units on the continent out of any 16-bit platform, the entire time the console was in existence, it had the Sega Genesis to compete with. The Genesis, the name in which the Mega Drive was being marketed under in the US, with Sega had managed to release the game Sonic the Hedgehog. This was done 3 months in the country before the Super Nintendo was widely available to consumers. The game would end up functioning as the Sega 16-bit console's packing game in both North America and Europe, which was an order made by Sega of America's CEO, Tom Kalinske. Critics praised Sonic the Hedgehog at the time as one of the greatest games ever made, making the launch of a Super Nintendo in America far tougher than its arrival to the Japanese market. Now, according to my analytics, the majority of fans of this gaming channel are all Americans. So I guess at this point in the video, I kind of have to say the obligatory Genesis does what Nintendo don't. The Super Nintendo arrived in the region in a time period where Genesis sales were climbing, with many opting to have the Genesis as their choice of 16-bit goodness instead. To put into perspective the war that the Super Nintendo had entered at launch, at Christmas of that same year, twice as many people would buy Genesises as they would Super Nintendos, with Sega controlling 65% of the 16-bit console market by January of 1992. This was the first time Nintendo were not in first place in the North American market since 1985, bringing an end to the 7 years of total dominance. Next up was of course the release of the system via Nintendo of Europe, with the device seeing release in countries such as the United Kingdom and Ireland in April of 1992 and being trickled out across the marketing region over a period of months, arriving in most EU countries by June and Australia by July. As highlighted earlier in the video, the NES had largely failed to pick up a respectable market share in most European countries, due to a combination of poor distribution deals, expensive pricing points, and greater competition from the world of gaming on home computers. I guess in Europe, Nintendo could simply not keep up with the Commodore, and the Commodore is keeping up with you. By this point in time though, the tide had shifted slightly in Nintendo's favour, with more NESs in people's homes than during the prime of the system. Throughout much of Europe, the NES have been distributed by Mattel, who would do a terrible job in the process. For the UK, Nintendo would replace Mattel with Serif Games in 1989, the company who had previously made Trivial Pursuit of all things a success in the region. Before Tom Kalinske had argued with Sega of Japan to make Sonic the Hedgehog a packing game, the man in charge of NES marketing at Serif Games had done exactly the same thing with his console, fighting Nintendo of Japan to make Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles a packing game for the NES system in the UK. While Nintendo hated the idea of having a non-Nintendo licensed game to help drive sales of their device, they relented and said on Hayes' head be it. With Turtles' popularity, this plan worked to perfection, and over Christmas of 1990, the NES outsold the Sega Master System in the country for the first time ever. You could say for Mike Hayes that by beating Sega, it was nothing more for him than a trivial pursuit? No? Super Nintendos in the UK and Europe would copy this strategy once more, with instead of having the console bundled with the likes of a Mario game, a system quickly became available packed with Street Fighter II, a game that had reached insane levels of popularity across the entire continent, with Street Fighter II arcade cabinets everywhere consumers looked. The opportunity to play Street Fighter II on a 16-bit console and take it home was a tantalising option, which in turn would lead to the Super Nintendo being more popular in general across Europe than that of the NES prior. People had a solid reason to own a Super Nintendo from day one. Despite this though, just like in North America, the Super Nintendo had a huge war in its hands, as the Sega Mega Drive and Sonic the Hedgehog were available throughout Europe before the Super Nintendo ever hit shelves. In fact, an argument could be made that Nintendo started in an even worse position here with the new console as they did stateside, as not only did Sonic the Hedgehog beat Super Mario well to the market, but due to Nintendo's slowness, the Blue Blur managed to beat Super Mario Bros. 3 to see in a release here too. What an absolutely ludicrous display from the Big N! Sega would go hard with their marketing across the entire region, and despite the Super Nintendo doing well, the superior positioning of the Super Mega Drive meant that the Nintendo hardware never stood a chance against the Supersonic system, even though the European Super Nintendo featured the same high quality sexy shell casing as the Japanese Super Famicom. Now aside from all of this, there was some other interesting launches of the Super Nintendo too. For example, as covered on this channel before, the arrival of the system in South Korea. The South Korean launch was a launch like no other, requiring a complete rebranding due to the fact that there was still a trade embargo in place from World War II, restricting trade between Japan and the South of Korea. This meant that the Super Famicom / Super NES could not be sold as a Nintendo console. So the console instead would be manufactured and distributed by Hyundai instead. The console sold as the Super Hyundai Comboy, and would end up selling abysmally, being crushed by the likes of MSX computers that were extremely popular in the region. Still though, this whole debacle did result in one of my favourite video game commercials of all time, and the only time I have seen the likes of Nintendo characters, Tiny Toons, Goku and Krillin all featured together singing in harmony. Wow. The early 90s was an amazing time to be alive, and by the looks of this ad, especially if you lived in Korea. Well, the good side of the country anyway. Moving from one launch to the next, this then takes us to Brazil in August of 1993, one of my favourite gaming regions in terms of their novel history. Brazil, like South Korea, has some pretty strange rules in place in terms of trading with outsiders. In Brazil's case, huge tariffs on the import of foreign electronics. Brazil, that has the uncommon PAL-M standard, would be the only country outside of North America that would get a Super Nintendo that would feature the ugly blocky shell that was designed by Lance Barr due to spending too much time thinking about bread. This launch was handled by Brazilian-owned company Playtronic, a joint venture between the toy company Estrela and consumer electronic company Gradiente. Speaking of joint ventures and Gradiente, I highly recommend the YouTube video created by my wife, Lady Decade, and Portuguese gaming YouTuber Stika, who both did a great job of explaining the history of the NES in Brazil, along with the dubious existence of the Gradiente Phantom system. It's a juicy tale indeed. As for the Super Nintendo in Brazil, it would be absolutely obliterated by the Sega Mega Drive to an even worse degree than the console was in other regions. Sega's Brazilian distributor Tectoy did an absolutely amazing job, still continuing to distribute new variants of the Mega Drive and Master System in the country right up until this very day. In Brazil, one could say that the Super Nintendo got Pele kicked to the curb. The Nintendo 16-bit system reportedly was also launched in Russia in 1994. However, I am struggling to find any additional information online regarding this supposed launch. One must add though that the region was notoriously dominated by Famiclone systems, with most people not knowing what Nintendo was and instead referring to the titles as Dendy games, with the Dendy being the dominant Famiclone variant in the region. So I guess that just about rounds up the launch of the Super Nintendo in all of the key markets around the world. Looking through everything from today's video, there seems to be a pattern that every launch was interestingly worse than the next. We started out in Japan where the system dominated, then the US where the console was neck and neck with the Genesis, then to Europe and Australia where the Super Nintendo narrowly lost to the Mega Drive. Then we went over to Brazil, where the console was obliterated, then finally to Russia, where the system seems to have sold so poorly that little information is online in the first place, with the console likely being destroyed by piracy. Is this just a case of the quicker the console gets to the market, then the less competition it will have to face? Or is it a case of Nintendo strategically launching their console simply first in the regions where they see themselves performing the best? I'd be curious to hear your take. So, ladies and gentlemen, that just about rounds up today's change of pace. I hope you enjoyed today's video, which was quite different from what I've produced on this channel recently, and found enjoyment from all of this nonsense. If you like this launch themed content, then consider asking me which console you would like to see spotlit next on here. Spotlit, is that a word, or should it be probably spotlighted? One would think. Anyway, let me know all of this in the comment section down below. The more stuff you post, hopefully the more it will drive traffic to this channel. Thank you. If you have newly discovered this channel, I have a cornucopia of content covering gaming history for you to go back and explore. So if you have found enjoyment from today, be sure to check out my extensive backlog that I've produced over the course of many years. Make sure you like this video, subscribe and hit that notification bell to ensure you see all of my future content. As we close, I would like to give a huge thank you to this channel's patrons, who without their support it would be much tougher to work on videos on this platform as a full-time job. So as always, thank you so much for your kind backing on these projects, with special thank yous going out to Sebastian Velez, A Murder of Crows, Carl Johnson, Heyo Paulo Lopez, Nostalgia Collector, Ben Harradine, Corey Imarsh Sr., Capcom vs SNK, Ron Dinched, Evan Border, Philip Mampf, Azra Arkai, Joaquin Varela, Michael Cullix, Ego, Jordan Durant, Angel Light 85, Ian Boyle, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Johnny Holly, August Piazza, Justin Wang, Hermes Gonzalez, Instant Gratification Monkey, Man Shovel, James Bishop, JB, Michael Hall, Wesley Sanghi, Drew Peacock, Langston Miller, Noob, Sarah Powell, Vlamik Renee, Morino Aliga, TOG, Driver, Adrian Hannington, Bernard NG, Dan Van Dammit, Louis Viant, John Bates, David Bow, Chris Fisk, Mike Bruno, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Retroverse.com, Casey Wrights in Spaces, Punk Toast, Gunther Hendricks, and everybody else who backs my work on the Patreon platform. I am forever grateful. Thank you very much. Cheerio.